let's say that you're in Washington, D.C. With a student from the university there, and you're on Capitol Hill, and the student is a committed Catholic, and you and the two of you are looking at Capitol Hill together and maybe see a representative or two that you recognize from the news. And the student asks you, speaking specifically in terms of, her status as a committed Catholic, um, Professor Crayson, what should my relationship with this place be? Not just as an American that's involved, but as thinking primarily now as a Catholic. What should my relationship with this government be? How do you think you would respond?
Well, there are a lot of things that could be said. I mean, most basically, it would be um, you need government. Catholic teaching makes it very clear that politics is needed by man, and so you need to live under government, and you should be careful to follow government, to follow politics, and so forth, to follow public affairs, and you should look at the kind of policies that are being coming out of government. You should maybe try to uh, contact, write whatever your members of Congress, your representatives, to let them know what you think about different public policy questions. Um, and you should always be aware of the fact that even though, of course, you need government, you need policies from government, for the sake of order, for the sake of creating good community, there can be some things that can come forth from government which may not be morally right, which may be unjust, and you should speak up about those things, and communicate those things. And if you see policies taking shape that are going in that direction, you should, before they come forth, you should let your representatives in government know about those things. Basically, you should say let them know what's wrong with them. In
Sure.
some respects, that's partly what I was just telling my American National Government class today. Basically, the very sort of thing. So.
So, um, you have some folks who say that Christians should be very involved in government, right there in government, working as staffers, pursuing the presidency, working in the Senate, working in the House of Representatives, working in other institutions um, to align the actions of government as much as possible with Christian principles. And then other Christians um, have a much more separatist approach that the government represents a kingdom of this world. We are citizens of another kingdom, and our involvement with this government is going to be minimal, and some will say to the extent possible, just non-involvement. Um, where would you place your own self? Speaking for yourself as a committed Roman Catholic, where would you place your own self if you have those two poles?
Well, it's a big problem to say you're just going to, isolate yourself from government or be uninvolved at all and so forth. I mean, uh, people are called to be involved in these things to a different degree for different people, of course. But you can't just sort of, somehow isolate yourself from politics. Politics. God has politics, so we can. As I was saying before, so people can live in, there can be good order and people can build good communities and so forth, it helps in terms of the relations of people to each other and so forth. And God is not wanting us to be kind of separated from all of it. That's here for a purpose and so forth, for His purpose. And you should try to be involved to the degree that you can. It's going to be a different degree for different people, obviously. Not everybody's going to be a staffer on Capitol Hill. Not everybody's going to be running for office or something like that. People are going to be involved to different degrees, but you shouldn't sort of abstract yourself from political life. That's a critical thing for man, and to do that is going to usher open the door for people who maybe don't have such good intentions and so forth. And who's going to oppose those kind of people when they have to be opposed, and who's going to work to build good communities and so forth if you're not going to be involved in politics to the degree that you reasonably can be and so forth. So um, I mean, I would say that you can't take that kind of position. It's not realistic, and it's not what Christ calls us to, and it's not, you know, it's not a reasonable kind of thing. You're involved to the degree that you can. can be, and you work the best you can to help to build a good community through politics and so forth.
Sure. In what you've written, or what I've read of what you've written, I remember reading lines that referred to um, the state, the government, ideally promoting the spiritual welfare of the people within a community. So without getting into any contemporary politics or any partisan questions, just generally thinking in general terms, what's in your mind when you write that kind of, when you write a sentence that refers to the state promoting the spiritual welfare of the people living within a society?
Well, religion is a crucial thing and a central thing for man. And the political order, can't be involved in terms of, you know, uh, interfering in the affairs of churches and so forth. It can't be involved in terms of, you know, um, promoting certain churches over others and so forth. But it has to respect religion. It has to create an atmosphere which is going to be um, promotive of religion, recognizing the need for religion and so forth. And that would involve things, I suppose, like, you know, um, certainly making sure religious liberty is protected and so forth. It would involve, maybe certain favor being given to religion, such as, we have tax exemptions for churches and so forth. Okay, things maybe like that. Maybe looking to churches for advice on certain public questions in an informal kind of way. Maybe people are involved in politics, seeking out information from that quarter as well as other quarters and so forth. Okay, it wouldn't be trying to minimize the importance of religion. It would try to maximize it without being excessively involved between church and state. Obviously, it would understand there's needs to be, religion is necessary for a good community and so forth. And again, if you have when you have a good flourishing religious situations, you're more likely to have a good community than if you've sort of pushed religion off to the side and so forth, or if you've been hostile to religion and so forth. And this is so to that extent, public officials, public decision makers have to be respectful for religion, and to understand that they have to build up, again, as I said, a community which is going to be promotive of religion, rightly understood. This isn't to say anything can go by the name of religion, okay, and so forth. I mean, you don't have to, you don't have to be promoting what calls itself religion if they're engaged in utter immorality and so forth, okay. Or you don't have to be promoting Satanism along the same level as you're promoting religion and so forth.
Mhm.
But you promote genuine religion. You create a situation where genuine religion can flourish and so forth.
Yeah. In a religiously pluralistic society, do you think that would, doing what you're calling for there, would that involve then primarily um, referring to natural law? So, for example, Southern Baptist theology and Roman Catholic theology, there's going to be a lot of similarity, but also some significant differences. But they're going to agree that there's a natural moral law that exists to which human beings should adhere. Is that one of the things you're saying, that a government, obviously can't, you know, adopt any particular theological system or promote any particular theological system, not within the United States, but it, are you saying, for example, that it could, though, promote the idea of a natural moral law that exists within Christian tradition, but also within other traditions, sort of, this thing that C.S. Lewis has written about, the Tao, these moral principles that seem to persist through history and exist across cultures. Is that kind of one of the things you might be getting at?
Well, government, has to embrace those things. I mean, it's the laws that government, the positive laws that government adopts, have to be based upon, or at least, not against natural law and so forth. Okay, I mean, a natural law can be understood by human reason, can be grasped by human reason, and so forth. And people often don't. Some people don't understand this kind of thing. A sound philosophy can reason out moral truth and so forth. Okay, and sound philosophy not connected with, specifically theology. Respect maybe theology, but if, by natural reasoning itself, you can reason out the natural moral law and so forth. So it's something that, obviously is going to apply to everybody. It's not any kind of a sectarian thing or anything like that. And it's not even a question of, again, of government having to, be respectful of it. It has to be governed by it, essentially. And Its laws have to be its positive laws have to be shaped according to it. It always has to be, I think, in the back of the minds of those who are making the laws for the state and so forth. They have to be properly formed themselves in a certain sense philosophically in terms of knowing about what is the natural law is and what the natural law is and so forth. And they also, I think, the part of this is that the government has a role not necessarily in aggressively uh, pushing virtue, but it has to create conditions that are going to stimulate virtue. Virtues are things which are tied up with natural. They apply to everybody. The same virtues apply to everybody, and so forth. And because we're human persons, and so forth, and human persons have an end. They have an end they are aiming for, and so forth. And government has to do what it can to promote that end. At least to create a situation where men can work toward achieving their end and so forth. They can't be putting obstacles in the way and so forth. And even in fact, as I said, the positive laws should encourage men in a virtuous direction, without having to be aggressive in terms of promoting virtue or something like that. Um, and when Lewis talked about the Tao, he's talking about natural moral law essentially, and how you see this you see this expressed in different cultures. I think he points out, I think it's the abolition of man. He talks about that at the end of it, in different cultures and so forth. And obviously, as there's a greater moral sophistication can develop over time. So if certain parts of the natural law in certain periods of time, certain cultures, men can't grasp some of those, time develops and men become more civilized, if you will, and they can grasp a fuller part of the natural law as time goes on and so forth, and so and religion, of course, helps. Sound religion helps in the development of that understanding better, obviously, and so forth. I mean, you can just talk about the coming of Christianity and how it moved the ancient world away from some of the weak parts, even of what the sound philosophers were pushing and so forth, or promoting. So yeah, I mean, it's not a question of whether political leaders can promote it; they have to be shaped by it. That's what we should say, I guess.
Sure. Maybe an example of what you're talking about there, improving on, the moral positions taken by even some of the great moral philosophers of ancient times. My understanding is Aristotle, for example, would not have any problem with the exposure of infants.
Yeah,
Um,
and then
as the Christians come along and say, no, those infants are made in
yeah,
the image of God, and we don't do
yeah.
that.
And also, the question of slavery in the ancient world. I mean, maybe some of the ancient thinkers are sort of moving back from it a little bit, but I think you kind of and you get towards Cicero in Rome, and I think you're moving. Maybe he moves about to of the ancient major thinkers. Maybe he moves us very closest to Christianity, perhaps. But
Mm.
yeah, Christianity then comes along and gives us the fullness of the natural moral law, and you know. And works to over time, over centuries, to evangelize. So you get the Christian period, the Christian era, then, and so forth. And the natural moral law is essentially it's respected by and held to be central to political and social life. Now, obviously, men are men, and so they're not always going to uphold all of it at different times, even when you have a Christian culture or something like that. But here you have when Christianity comes along and begins to shape the culture, over time, all those principles become more and more clear and so forth, and start stressed more and all that. Slavery dies out as you get into the later ancient period in the Middle Ages. Slavery dies out. I mean, I suppose it comes back later there's been some in the aftermath of religious upheaval and also a movement towards secularization in some quarters and so forth. And somebody gets the idea of going and bringing slaves up from Africa and so forth. I don't know all the background of that, but I mean, there's been a movement to some degree away from the Christian sort of the Christian kind of a consensus at that point in some respects. And but yeah, I mean, and you could talk about other things as well, obviously, that immorality, but that's sort of something that kind of comes to mind essentially.
Sure. I guess maybe just to back up a little bit for folks who they're not familiar with the idea of a natural moral law. Just how would you, in your own understanding, how would you describe what that is? Just what is the natural moral law?
Well, I think most people can understand that there are, even if they're deficient ethically themselves, they can understand there is uh, there is good ethics and so forth. There's sound ethics. They can understand that notion at least, you know.
Yeah.
And I think you have to make a good argument to people, and so forth. That well, again, men can reason these things out. And here are the problems if you go in a different direction and so forth. You can maybe begin to talk in terms of just the although we don't shape morality primarily on the basis of results and consequences. Maybe that's how you can lead into this with some people and so forth. That look at the positive results that have come from maybe cultures which have embraced sound morality and so forth.
Mm.
And then get people to start thinking about how you can reason these kind of things out. You can reason these moral principles out, and they'll have a hard time with especially difficult moral principles, maybe. But maybe you can explain further as you take them along and so forth in the discussion. You have repeat discussions maybe with somebody. You can maybe motivate them to see, that different principles. Here are the principles you have to reason out further. Here's why they're valid. They're valid and so forth. And you can but it takes you to embracing over time, embracing a more complete picture of the natural law, I guess.
Right.
As you go.
Would some of these principles apply to the family? And I guess I'd want to relate that, to what extent in your thinking, does the idea of a natural moral law apply to the creation of families, the maintenance of the family, and, connecting that to the political significance of the family?
Well, I mean, yeah, you can really go back to even Aristotle on this, and talking about, the family. He talks about, the family situation essentially, and how this is kind of foundational for the community and then the political order. Of course, community and political order essentially, parallel each other, and so forth. He doesn't talk about, some people nowadays they talk about here's society, and here's the political order and so forth. They kind of separate. Political order is only one part of society. For Aristotle, there was a meshing of these two. It was the political order was you can talk about a society outside the context of a political order. He'd even use a term like society, So the family was seen even for him as a kind of a foundational thing. I mean, it forms people. It forms the soul of people basically. It's very central in terms of the initial formation of the soul basically. And the soul's to be rightly ordered. If the soul's going to be rightly ordered for enough people, they're going to go out and they're going to be good people in the community and good citizens and so forth. They're not going to be perfect. Nobody's perfect, but they're going to be good, basically good people and good citizens. And you're going to have a sounder community. You're going to have peace and good relationships among people and so forth, and good moral principles that are going to prevail. So the family is where the formation of the soul begins. Now, I think Aristotle understands that it's not complete in the family. The family does, much of the foundational work and a lot of it, but then the political order itself has to be concerned, as I was maybe indicating a few minutes ago, has to be concerned about the matter of virtue. By its laws, it has to further shape virtue, try to shape virtue. And in our age, for example, people don't like to hear that a lot of times, but actually, as I tell my students very often, they really, when you look at so many of our laws, they are really geared toward helping to shape the soul in a certain way. Not just maybe obvious ones, but take laws about civil rights, for example. I mean, they're trying to not just make sure that people are treated properly, but they're also trying to change the attitudes of people who might not be inclined to treat certain groups properly and so forth. Okay, and you can talk about that. Talk about in terms of various of our positive laws. They really are kind of geared toward trying to change human thinking in hopefully a positive way and so forth, and so on. And even though you have these people will say, well, we don't think the law should be involved with the positive law should be involved with, with virtue anyway. But that's really what the way they are acting goes contrary to that claim that they're making, and so forth. They really are seeking to shape people's thinking in a positive way, according to what they think is a positive way. They might be right about what the positive way is. They might not be right in all things and so forth. But I mean, they are seeking to shape, the human soul effectively. They're seeking to shape, the thought of people, the orientation that people have, the positions they'll embrace and so forth personally, which, will shape their attitudes about things and so forth.
So one of the things I think I'm hearing, then I'm interpreting what you're saying, is that if a you have a natural moral law that exists, and at its core are key moral ideas. The golden rule, I think, would be one of them. Treat others as you would want to be treated. Um, and I think what I'm, picking up from you is that if a government puts itself at odds with the natural moral law, or if a political movement puts itself at odds with the natural moral law, then it's setting itself and its adherents or its citizens up for disaster. And I'm thinking, for example, of Marxism, which pits itself, at least in Marx's own words, against the family and against religion. And I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, well, these are two basic building blocks of human society that and we know about the significance of these things from the natural moral law. Marxism pits itself against these two things, and so we could predict then that it's going to fail, it's going to lead to misery. And as I look at the record, I do think that that actually is the record. It has led to a lot of anger, a lot of misery, a lot of poverty, etc. And I guess the interpretation would be, for whatever other reason, Marxism fails because it pits itself against the rudiments of the natural moral law. What does that reflect your view?
I mean, yeah, I mean, authoritarianism can last for a while. I have an old newspaper clipping on my bulletin board here. It's from the time of the collapse of all those communist regimes back in '89 and so forth, up until '91 when the Soviet Union collapsed. It says, and it's a picture of, the Berlin Wall collapsing and people climbing on the Berlin Wall and so forth. You remember that, and as East Germany's collapsing, and it says, sooner or later, all tyrannies crumble. Yeah, I mean, authoritarianism can be around for a while, but it destroys, ultimately does destroy itself and so forth, and because it's so contrary to what man needs, what man is, and so forth. And you know, yeah, when you repudiate the natural moral law, it's going to come back on you. It's going to obviously cause overwhelming damage when you do that. I mean, and yeah, look at, yeah, you're referring to the suffering of people under communism and other authoritarian regimes and so forth. Um, and of course, what always happens in these regimes is the people who have power tend to be the ones who lord everything over everybody else and suppress everybody else to their own advantage. I mean, Marxism, talked about sweeping human equality, but let's just say the rulers are much more equal than everybody else were, and so
Sure.
forth.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the greater treatment of people were in regimes like ours, for example. Where regimes that um, democratic republics, historically and so forth, that have been concerned about, you know, have had a foundation in solid philosophical thinking about what's good for people and so forth. And even, of course, Aristotle talked about there are good forms and perverted forms of government. I mean, kingship is a good form of government by one, but that, of course, the opposite of that is the worst form of government, tyranny. Basically, and aristocracies as opposed to oligarchies, and so forth. So you can have regimes don't have to be, regimes where the many are involved in ruling. The best, I think, Aristotle gives a certain nod, though, in the best sense, absolutely, to, well, I mean, if you had the utterly capable king and the utterly capable and utterly virtuous king, I think he sort of indicates that'd be the very best regime. But that doesn't happen hardly ever. So the best regime in practical terms is the well, a democratic republic, basically. The polity, what he called the polity. And where the people are playing some role in ruling and so forth. So a mixed regime, and that's what I mean. If you look back at the American tradition, in basic sense, that's what we were, kind of a mixed regime, and so forth. And we can look at how things have shaken out over time in history and so forth. But basically, the character of our constitutions like that. We have the People's House initially, the House of Representatives, the sort of quote unquote aristocratic House, the Senate. Then you have the sort of American version of something like a kingship, the presidency. I mean, was it some of the thinkers like was it Bryce maybe that you look at the American presidency like the kingship of Britain, but without the hereditary element, without the corruption, is what he said. And so
Yeah,
forth. So,
sure.
uh,
Yeah. And does what you've just been describing, to what extent do they fit with, accord with subsidiarity, which I've seen you mention a number of times, and that's a word that I do, especially in my mind, associate with Catholic thinking about government. Does what you've described, I mean, to what extent does that fit with subsidiarity? I guess more basically, what is the idea of subsidiarity?
Well, subsidiarity is the notion. I'd say it's one of the most central principles of Catholic social teaching, okay, and Catholic social thought. It's the idea that you do things, if things, government. Let's say things are to be done at the level, things are to be done privately outside of government if they can be, okay. And if things have to go into the realm of government, they should first go into the realm of government closest to the people and so forth. And then it's only when they can't be done there and they have to be done, you go up to the higher levels of government. And the same thing really is within private entities too. I mean, it seems to suggest that it's maybe best to have businesses that would be sort of smaller businesses if you can. Okay, if things can't be done in that way to produce certain products that are needed to go to the bigger corporation and so forth. But yeah, we think of it especially in terms of government though, but it applies otherwise there too. But there's some things which have to be done by government. I tell my students, for example, you couldn't expect the city of Steubenville to carry out national defense, for example.
Right.
Some things have to go into government, into the highest level of government, obviously. One of the big problems, of course, we've had throughout the 20th century to the present has been that government has things have increasingly gone into government, which had previously not been in government, and then gone to centralized government, and that creates various problems. Okay, I mean, you can see government is not. If that happens, then the localized situation, which is often very critical, is not paid attention to enough, and so forth. And you know, certain injustices grow out of that. Things become distant. People can't get things addressed that have to be addressed, and so forth, because things have gone off in a distant place, and so forth. And then it also it's often talked about by the writers who speak about this, that it undercuts the role of the family, the role of the church, and so forth. The family, the work of the family is taken over by government and so forth in many respects, and it moves from one thing to another in terms of sort of closing out the family. But subsidiarity means, you do things privately if they can be done there, and if they have to go into government, you do it at the level close to the people. You only go up to the highest levels if you have to, and so forth.
Yeah, and so I'm assuming if that plays out, then the federal government is going to have certainly compared to today, is going to have a pretty limited role if the
Yeah,
idea of subsidiarity is played out, because most of what they're doing is going to be done at the local,
yeah.
the state level.
Yeah, and of course that's the way it was for much of earlier American history, and I think you get into the 20th century. I suppose it begins with the progressive era, but certainly the New Deal, accelerates the role of government. Now, of course, when you have critical situations, the New Deal was the Great Depression. You're going to expect then government's going to move into the picture more and so forth. The thing is, though, that when times change and they get back to a more normal situation, then government has to pull back. That's what government, it seems to me, doesn't typically do. I mean, for different reasons. I mean, governments, the people get used to a certain thing. Government gets used to a range of powers it didn't have before. There are more people working for government who have an interest in their jobs and so forth, even at that level. So it's difficult to talk about government pulling back from things. And different commentators have talked about that and so forth. And you know, it's really the need to have people who are in government who are properly formed intellectually, philosophically, and also in terms of their personal character, their soul's properly formed, so they'll want to try to do that. And of course, it won't be easy to do that. You have to do it kind of sequentially and so forth, because we've gotten so used to this, and it's been so long now that we've gone in this other direction. I
Mhm.
mean, I think that different politicians have come along and they have called for this kind of thing. Ronald Reagan was one, I think, for example. You have some who do this, but they don't really kind of care. They don't or can't carry it through typically. They talk about it maybe, and maybe they make some sort of marginal sort of moves, but they don't really carry it through further. I sort of think back to the Reagan period, and I think that maybe he needed to really, in a certain sense, quote unquote, attack the bureaucracy. I don't think he was looking to try to winnow down the federal bureaucracy in a significant way. That's what needed to be done. And But at least to begin that effort, to begin to kind of go in that direction. But in any event, yeah, I mean, you have to have politicians who are going to be rightly formed, have the right ideas, and don't have any interest that they're trying to further, again, the proper formation of the soul, and that can begin to happen. And one of the problems we've had is the secularization of religion in America in many respects. I mean, and you certainly see it with in the Catholic Church with the leadership not wanting to assert itself fully on many different moral principles and so forth. The bishops and so on. Some do, but some don't. And so forth. And I guess with you looked at what's happened with Protestant denominations. Maybe since the post-World War II period, especially 1960 onward and so forth. The 60s were so defining in so many ways, and in one of the books I wrote about, I talked about this a bit in terms of or maybe a couple of books in terms of the secularization of many of these churches. I mean, and so in Protestant quarters, the evangelicals are the ones who are especially assertive of sound morality and so forth, and most especially on fire for the faith. Now, I'm saying there are obviously exceptions. I mean, there are some good Anglican congregations and so forth, but by and large, you look at like where the mainline churches went. Mainline Protestant churches from the '60s onward, especially, and they kind of followed the culture in some respects. And if that's happening, obviously, you're not getting the kind of the kind of religious pressure on the politicians, or not just pressure, but formation of the politicians that's going to happen and so forth.
So
And
what I think I'm hearing you say is, again, I'm sort of interpreting what you're saying and adding to it, but it sounds like you're saying we could use more churches that offered up less spiritualized politics and more plain speaking Christian witness.
yeah, now spiritualized politics, I'm not sure how you're defining that. How would
Well,
you?
I mean, where politics come first, but since
Right.
we're a church organization, we have to, find some Bible verse to attach to it. But you look at what's going on, it's clearly politics come first, the Christian language comes later as a gloss. And it sounds like you're saying the country would be better if we had less of that and more churches speaking specifically as churches from a specific theological outlook. Is that what you're
Yeah, yeah, that's certainly an important part of it. I mean,
saying?
yeah, in some churches you find this with some of the bishops in the Catholic Church and so on. They're ready to, they're talking about public policy positions a lot and so forth. And maybe how much they doing in terms of leadership in their own diocese is to just be concerned about, again, formation of the soul. According to teachings of the church and so forth. I mean, there have been some teachings of the church, where they just kind of in this post-World War II period, especially from the '60s onward. I look at the Catholic Church, you see it in the Protestant denominations too, and that is, certain things that were part of traditional morality they're not paying much attention to anymore. A lot of them involving sexual questions and so forth. Gee, you look back, I know it's so people don't want to even talk about it anymore, but if you go back in the history of the country, go back to until the 1920s and so forth, nobody would have talked about contraception, for example, and along comes Margaret Sanger, but the forms Planned Parenthood is pushing all this, then they start pushing abortion a few decades later and so forth. And, of course, and happened with many of the Protestant denominations and in terms of the contraception thing. And with the Catholic Church, yeah, the teaching has been there. One of the great things Pope Paul VI was to many people think it wasn't a real outstanding papacy, but I remember one writer saying that the highlight of it was the encyclical Humanae Vitae about human life. And one of the things he talked about very centrally was about the traditional contraceptive teaching and so forth. And he took a lot of flack for it and so forth. A lot of the bishops, so they weren't going to stress it a lot. They weren't going to repudiate it, but they were going to stress it a lot in their dioceses and so forth, And yeah, the sexual morality thing has been a main thing. But, again, we're talking about the family. We're talking earlier about the family, the centrality of the family. This obviously feeds right into the question of the family. And, and if you start letting the sexual morality go by the boards, and you're not going to be concerned about sound sexual morality, it's going to spill over into the political order eventually and so forth. And, I mean, you can see it directly and indirectly. I mean, directly with the breakdown of the family and all the situation, juvenile delinquency and crime and all these things that come out of that and so forth. And then other things that develop from that later on. I mean, it really takes you right back to Aristotle understanding about the centrality of the family for the formation of the soul and so forth. And
Sure.
the family, the basis for shaping a good political order. Other great thinkers understanding that through time and so forth. And
Yeah.
so there you kind of have like these things are connected, and people most writers don't want to see that or don't talk about it or can't connect on it or something. But these things are really quite connected. They're not man is not, you don't divide man up and so forth. Here's a man as a whole, and of course these things are all part of what shapes the individual and so forth. And ultimately, it's going to shape the community and all that.
And we need, I'm here again, here's what I'm hearing you saying. We need the church. In this case, we're speaking specifically of the Catholic Church. We need the Catholic Church to speak clearly as the Catholic Church on these issues.
Yeah, the documents are there. The documents do it okay. And I mentioned like Paul VI, with the encyclical Humanae Vitae, and of course John Paul II with his many documents and encyclicals and so forth. But the problem is, the bishops then have to enunciate. They have to stress that and so forth, stress those things, and they have to put them into practice in terms of their pastoral leadership and so forth. And they have to have in the church, the Catholic Church, they have to have their priests do that in the parish level and so forth. And you hear many Catholic writers talking about how, when's the last time you even hear about, many sermons on sexual morality and so forth, maybe a little bit here and there, but not very much. And yeah, maybe, it filters down. The things that have to be stressed aren't getting stressed. The things really do, a lot of things really take shape from the leadership at the top and so forth, and in many areas of human life, you see this, good leadership is just critical and so forth,
Sure.
and I mean, I'm not saying the bishops are heretical or something like that. It's just that, many of them are just not, that's been one of the things commented about the bishops. And again, you can say the same thing about many of the Protestant leaders and so forth, that they're not stressing certain things. They're not preaching and emphasizing these, to the people and so forth. And so people just they forget about them and they don't pay attention to certain things.
Now to shift gears, and obviously you're not speaking for the Catholic Church, you're speaking for yourself as a Roman Catholic. Um, Suppose a student comes to you after class and says, I'm thinking of serving in the military. But there is a long and very robust tradition within the church thinking about just war,
Right.
just war theory, and we reflect on the conflicts the United States has been in, let's just say from the beginning of the 20th century up. And I think for a couple of those, so far as I understand just war theory, I think a couple of those would probably be okay, but others probably not. It's a complicated situation anyway. And feel free to comment on this. But the student says, I'm thinking about the military, but I'm also worried about being involved in a war that we look back on with regret. And we look back on and think, well, if we could run that again, we wouldn't have done that. I don't think that's the case with the Second World War. But certainly I think in relation to Japan and Germany, that would be my sense. And you don't hear many people regretting that. But Vietnam, obviously, Iraq, Afghanistan. What would you say to that student? Again, Catholic to Catholic. I'm interested in military service, but I am concerned about getting pulled into a war, being part of a war that we're going to look back on and say, that was not a just war.
Well, I think the church tends to say a lot of times in practical terms that you can give a lot of the benefit of the doubt to the state, okay, and maybe it would be different in if you're talking about the Catholics in Russia or something. They would say they were Orthodox, okay, and people are attached to religion at all, but it might be different. But in the American context that we're talking about, that you can give and maybe generally you give the benefit of the doubt to the decision makers because you oftentimes don't have all the information. They do, you typically don't, and so forth. See, I look back on the wars the U.S. has been involved in, so I'd even say some of these. Some people would raise about Vietnam. I know one of my senior colleagues here was in Vietnam and so forth. And I know he said to me just on one occasion that he thought that it was, and I read something he said about he thought it was a just war. I can't say that it was an unjust war. Now, maybe there were decisions that were made about it, things that were done. There are always questions about what you do in war and so forth, and one of the things about a just war is how you carry out the war and so forth, and I guess you could make the argument too about the end of World War II and the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and and it's okay. That's a question you could really get into and debate about. A nation has to follow the moral principles as well as it possibly can. It seems to me, and you get involved. You have to meet the criteria of just war, and if you get involved, you always have to be working to try to end the conflict by stressing negotiation. John Paul II stressed this so much about negotiation. It was a central thing they talked about. I think he did one of his documents was about negotiation quite a bit and so forth. And you know, um, this is something that a nation like the U.S., especially, which has this very powerful nation, has to be working to do.
Yeah, so in your mind, there really is no significant tension or conflict with the idea of a committed Catholic serving in the military and
Oh, in fact, no, I think not. As long, yeah, I think we've had a good record with the just war thing, and we don't have an, I don't think we have. Students can get involved with ROTC here. I think there's a program that it's not right here on campus. I know they had different things that they've been doing. They were connected with another school in Pittsburgh or something. Now I think they can still get, as far as I know, they can still get involved in that. And I've had students who have a small number have gone on to the military, and so forth. You know. No, I mean, you're not. The church has made clear that you're not. It's not wrong to be part of the military and so forth. And you can give the benefit of the doubt to the state and so forth. These questions about warfare, and the U.S. I think has had a pretty decent record about it. They try to avoid getting involved in conflicts if they can. I think for the most part, and so I don't think it poses any kind of a problem for Catholics to be involved in the military. I mean, we have a chaplaincy, Catholic chaplains in the military, Protestant chaplains in the military, but the Catholic Church is they have a chaplain sort of corps basically and so forth. And so I think we have an archbishop that's in charge of that basically and so forth. And so Catholics can feel free to do that. It's not a calling for everybody, obviously, but for some people, yeah. I mean, and I think that's an old tradition, that the church has never had a pacifist kind of background. It's always this just war was something that took hold very early on, and I think it comes out. Maybe it goes back to Saint Augustine at least, maybe even before, at least Saint Augustine, and so it's never been we've never been pushing pacifism. It's not like I mean, certain very small, some of the more smaller denominations pushing pacifism, but mostly in the whole Christian tradition, Catholics, Protestants, they have not been pacifistic. They've seen that you can have a just war.
this time let's bring a student into your office and the student has been studying early Christianity, the first centuries, and has learned that, one of the major things that got Christians into trouble with the empire was their refusal to um, you know, involve themselves in the ritual acknowledging the genius of the emperor. I think of it kind of as, pledging allegiance to the emperor. And this is one of the things, from the Roman point of view, that made them look like traitors. Um, and so imagine the student then comes to your office, again, the student's a committed Catholic, and thinks, well, if the early Christians, if they declined to pledge any kind of allegiance to the emperor on the ground that their emperor presided over a different empire, the empire of heaven, then is it okay for me to pledge allegiance to the flag? How do you think you might respond to that student?
Well, those Roman emperors, they were trying to basically make themselves almost like gods, effectively. I mean, they were saying that, we're above. Here's the state above the church, the state above religion, and so forth. And I think there was something different that they were seeking. They were seeking to, effectively almost be divine themselves, to be treated like they were divine themselves. There is a rightly understood notion of patriotism, and as opposed to nationalism, or something like that. I mean, a well-ordered love of one's nation, that's patriotism. And when you pledge allegiance to the flag, you're saying, it's a commitment to your nation state, but it doesn't make it above everything and so forth. And I don't think the Pledge of Allegiance ever sought to do that.
And to pledge allegiance to the country, acknowledging, here's what I'm hearing you saying, acknowledging that you're not stating this is my primary allegiance, but it is a voicing of commitment to a country that on the whole, certainly compared historically to the competition, has done pretty well.
Yeah, and I don't think with the Pledge of Allegiance, for example, we never understood it to be, embracing anything that was rejecting that whole tradition. Okay, we understood it was accepting of that, and frankly, when the Pledge of Allegiance was so universally stressed and so on, the country was still in pretty good straits in terms of that tradition.
So picking up on the distinction you're making between what the early Christians in the first couple centuries were asked to do in reference to the emperor and the Pledge of Allegiance, keeping in mind that distinction, and the problem in the Roman Empire is that the emperor is a god, a god, and so they're saying Pledge
Yeah,
allegiance to
right.
God. Christians say no. I mean, in Catholic thinking, then, when a government does begin to take the place of God, to demand this kind of allegiance from people, to exercise godlike powers over people. In Catholic tradition, are we, if a government gets to that place, are we then in a place where there are grounds for thinking about resistance?
Well, there's discussion about that in Catholic writing, and so forth. And you can give a lot of benefit of the doubt to the state, and you can't, uh, I mean, you make there are prudential judgments involved here and so forth, and sometimes resistance can lead to other problems, and so it can compound the whole thing and so forth. There can be, you have to make a serious analysis about this in light of the teaching very carefully and so forth, and as applied to the particular situation, and I think usually, give the benefit of the doubt to the state, but there's a point at which maybe you can't any longer. And then there could be the question is, what can you do to resist, and, you know, um, you're not called upon to, people can have an extreme view about almost a martyr complex or something like that. You have to avoid that, and so forth. But, you can maybe resist in ways that are reasonable and so forth, and most of the situations are not going to involve very utterly serious situations, utterly serious conflicts, or they're not going to involve necessitate utterly serious responses and so forth. So maybe just there are different things you can do, maybe short of to show lack of cooperation and so forth, or lack of willingness to go along and so forth. And in a country like the U.S., you don't see too many cases like this where there's going to be a major kind of assault upon, the teaching and so forth, the Catholic teaching, or whatever, what the church teaches. And so you can there are ways you can resist. I mean, they resist. I mean, that are sort of reasonable and limited and so forth. I mean, the state might be embracing certain positions which are morally, opposed to the church, certain moral principles of the church in a very obvious way. Take abortion, for example. Okay, but Catholics are not called upon to go and storm the abortion clinics. There are different things you can do. You make prudential judgments. And the people who can resist, if some hospital, says we're going to start doing abortion, some secular hospital, or Catholics working there, they can just say, I'm not going to participate in that, and so forth. And they can probably appeal to things in the law that can protect them and so forth with that. But otherwise, I guess they just probably look for another job or something. I mean, they can't. Maybe you can't do what you can imposing it. They can impose it within the hospital in terms of opposing that direction of policy and so forth. Uh, you know, um, and I don't know, tax dollars to fund abortions or something like that. I mean, you don't. I think you're not called upon necessarily to say I'm going to withhold that part of my tax, because it's always the question. The money goes to a lot of other things too, and how much may go to paying out money for abortions through federally funded for Medicaid or something like that. Be very very small, tiny number, and tiny amount, and so forth. I mean, people can object to that and so forth. Go to their representatives and say we want to stop this. And that worked in the past. I mean, they really cut out almost all the funding for Medicaid abortions. It came down pretty much to these, almost to the life of the mother, and maybe slightly other so-called hard cases. So, I mean, those things they were effectively done. So, you can do things like that. You don't have to have the major, assault. And sometimes, you want to be more modest about it anyway. So there can be people, who want to make a big issue about something. Maybe that's not the way to oppose something. Sometimes the more effective way to oppose something is to do it in a more restrained way and keep doing it and so forth, and lining up other people to do it. And that maybe works better and so forth. It's prudential. People have to make good prudential judgments.